Back in 1870, France was rightfully put in its place by the Germans when they were crushed in the Franco-Prussian War, enabling the glorious creation of the German Reich. But the wily frogs were patiently waiting to reclaim Alsace-Lothringen, their land, taken by Germany in the war. Eventually, the time was ripe when Serbia assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and triggered World War I. Allied with Russia and Britain, the Triple Entente treacherously invaded the honorable Central Powers and were destined to fail once Russia was knocked out, until America bailed the two out, destroying the empires of Germany and Austro-Hungary. 20 years later, Germany, eager for revenge, desecrated France in World War II amidst a milieu of atrocities before being defeated and divided. These horrors all could have been avoided in the best possible timeline, one where France loses the Great War.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
But fear no more, you 52,000 Deutsch, and the 90% of Frenchmen who have yet to subscribe, because you're too busy surrendering. Things were different here. France's days were numbered. For France to lose the Great War, Germany needed Austria-Hungary to be much stronger, so they could bear the brunt of the Russians in the east, the Serbians in the Balkans, and the Italians in the Alps. So, back in 1878, Austria-Hungary went on a series of massive political and military reforms after their disastrous Bosnian expedition, adding the Third Crown of Croatia to East Balkan unrest, reclaiming their spot as a true great power by the time of the war. When World War I started, the Central Powers vanquished Serbia, Russia, and Italy, who was dismantled into Austrian puppets, before turning their eyes on France, the eternal enemies of the Germanic race. You can watch all that in more detail in the previous videos in the series, but welcome to the world of Doppeladler. The combined might of Britain and France could barely withstand the pressure of the entire German army by 1918, so when the entire Austrian military started pouring across the Alps, they were in deep trouble. Germany far outnumbered them with nearly 2 million troops, as around 900,000 arrived in the east. So France was buckling under the pressure, then another 1.3 million Habsburgs showed up, forcing the already thin lines to divide in two.
Hello there.
To make matters even worse, the French army was suffering with mass morale issues, and many were disillusioned with the government and leadership. Not to be outdone, the government responded by losing faith in them too. Domestically, Germany had been secretly funding communists within the French section of the Workers' International, SFIO, to destroy France from within. Communist strikes plagued cities, weakening their production, maiming the military effort. Although they were rapidly pushing the Entente back, Germany attempted to bring Spain into the fold as well, offering them Roussillon, populated by the Catalans, and the French Basque Country. The Spaniards, however, were in no position to fight with a weak government and a weaker military. Austria and Germany were well aware of this, but simply wanted to use Spain to open yet another front, sparing tens of thousands of their own men, while Spain could let their army die. Spain was deeply divided over the war, with conservatives and monarchists generally supporting the Kaisers, seeing their victory as a return to the natural tradition and order of Europe, while liberals and separatists generally supported the Entente, hoping to weaken the monarchy further. The biggest backers of the Spanish entry were the Carlists, a traditionalist monarchist faction who became increasingly pro-Austrian after the restoration of the Papal States, viewing Emperor Karl Habsburg as the protector of the Catholic Church. Jaime, Duke of Madrid, their claimant to the Spanish throne, and the current head of the Bourbon resided within Austria, who quickly propped him up for their own gain, reaching a secret arrangement for Habsburg aid. Ultimately, though, King Alfonso XIII preferred neutrality, so Spain stayed out of the war. This was relatively insignificant, as it was only a matter of months before the first major breakthrough, with the Austro-Hungaro-Croatian troops, that's a mouthful, breaching the French defenses, taking Toulon, Marseille, and Lyon in their push to the Rhone River. Back in Paris, the French high command assured the government that the situation was under control. Technically, this was true, just not under their control. However, before any armistice was signed, the German investment into the Marxists paid off. As France was in the midst of their usual political turmoil, the communists then decided to start a revolution to tear down the bourgeoisie and free the proletariat. Led by Charles Rappaport, an ethnically Lithuanian Jew who migrated to France at the end of the 19th century, the SFIO split between Marxists and more moderate reformists. Those that left, under Albert Thomas, merged with the General Confederation of Labor, CGT, under Léon Jouhou's syndicalist party, forming the new Workers' Unity Party, PUT, quickly shifting away from Marxism towards syndicalism. Germany had been covertly shifting money, vehicles, and weapons to Rappaport for years, and had infiltrated his movement with spies, similar to their historical strategy with Lenin in Russia. The infiltration was so successful that General Erich von Falkenhayn joked that there were more Germans than French in Paris by the end of the war. Rappaport, convinced by German agents, transformed the multitude of strikes into a workers' revolution, quickly taking over the city. As expected, a few other cities with strong communist presence followed suit, but they had vastly overestimated their support as Germany fed them faulty intel. Expectations for support within the lower ranks in the military turned out to be in vain, as the few troops who tried to join the ranks were either court-martialed or just shot. With the war to Germany all but lost, many of them wanted to win something, so they settled on slaughtering a bunch of poor workers. Shortly after, the Germans followed the Austrians, breaking the Franco-British army, finally repeating their forefathers' glory in the Franco-Prussian War, arriving at Paris.
I want to say, man, the first time was so nice, I had to do it twice.
The Third French Republic, bereft of Paris, signed an armistice with the Central Powers before promptly collapsing after yet another defeat to the Germans in the past 50 years. The totality of their failure, combined with the Communist Revolution, simply proved too much. Many Frenchmen called out for a new Napoleon who would once more deliver them from the Teutonic menaces. He didn't exist. Within a few weeks, the Central Powers occupied the majority of France, mirroring that of the Seventh Coalition after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. But these enemies were hell-bent on retaliation and had no interest in rehabilitating the French. Official lines were drawn up, dividing France between Germany and the Habsburgs. Britain, fearing that the Marxist creed could spread home, quickly signed an armistice with Germany. Nothing scared their government like workers asking for a fair wage. Unlike the Second World War, the British were not resolute on dragging this out and hoping to ultimately vanquish the Germans. Many within Parliament were already fed up with the leadership of Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and more importantly, over 2 million Brits were captured by the Germans. The people wanted their boys to return home, which Germany refused to do until peace was concluded. The Central Powers had finally won World War I. Germany was not content with France blowing itself up, though, as Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg stated in his memorandum, quote, "France must be so weakened as to make her revival as a great power impossible for all time." Louis-Napoleon Leroux, no relation to the Corsican, was a Breton nationalist who fled to England at the start of the war to avoid fighting for France. The most extreme within the German military smuggled him back to the continent, where he quickly arrived in Brittany and declared Breton independence. The French military was powerless to resist the carnage, as Germany prevented them from fighting back, threatening to break the armistice.
This is fine.
To make matters even worse, at the same time, Algerian rebels, eager to shake off their French overlords, sensed the opportunity, launching a massive series of bombings and killings. Thousands of Pieds Noirs, French settlers, were massacred to the horror of all European powers. The most gruesome attack was on the Cathedral of Saint Philippe of Algiers, a former mosque, where the entire congregation and priests died. To the Europeans, a bunch of dirty Muslims attacked God-fearing Christians for no reason, ignoring the brutal colonial regime they were under. Austria was especially perturbed by the developments, so worked with the British Mediterranean Navy to support the colonial regime, with around 20,000 Anglo-Austrian servicemen fighting for the French. While it might be surprising to some, as mentioned in Austria-Hungary's Last War, 1914 to 1918, Emperor Karl was historically fed up with his northern neighbor for numerous reasons that we can discuss in future videos, so he tried to distance his empire from the German one. Here, this entailed favorable treatment towards France to foster a future alliance, so he wished to preserve as much land from German hands as possible, therefore unofficially backed local French resistance with weapons and supplies. Habsburgs quickly cooperated with the French military and their right wing, who had been suppressed under the Third Republic as anti-republicans, to form the Garde Blanche, White Guard. The Garde Blanche was similar to the historical Freikorps, unofficially used to destroy communist and separatist rebels that plagued Germany, though here it was in France. Although not a new Napoleon, Marshal Ferdinand Foch decided that enough was enough as he saw his country tearing itself apart. Unlike most French generals, Foch escaped blame, which was mainly shifted onto Pétain. After all, Foch had successfully defeated the Germans at the Marne, only to be thwarted by the corrupt politicians in the National Assembly. The new Fourth Republic government was powerless to hurt a fly, so garnered Austrian aid, and he was ultimately responsible for ending the chaos. Germany was pleased by all the instability, but by this point, the communists had served their purpose, and they were beginning to get a bit worrisome with all their radical ideas. Foch, known for his violent nature, historically quoted as saying, "There is but one means to extenuate the effects of enemy fire. It is to develop a more violent fire oneself." Serving as a quasi-military dictator, with some liberals worriedly comparing him to Napoleon, ominously warning that it would only be a matter of months before he would have his own coup of 18 Brumaire, seizing dictatorial powers. The Marshal was a well-known fervent disciple of Bonaparte, having meticulously studied every battle of the former emperor. So, Foch took this as a compliment. Within a few months of the outbreak of the Civil War, the SFIO and the Algerians were slaughtered by the military and Garde Blanche, while any known collaborators or supporters of any of those rebel groups were eradicated in what later became known as the Purge Blanche. The Bretons, however, were spared, as Foch needed like-minded conservatives to weaken the left's power in the future National Assembly. The government, of course, denied any involvement with the Purge, but somehow maintained the Garde Blanche was not responsible. Amidst the Civil War, German, Austrian, Hungarian, and Croatian diplomats had been busy negotiating the Second Treaty of Frankfurt, a further reminder of the previous French humiliation in 1870. Mirroring Versailles, France and Belgium were not given any representation, as the Central Powers instead forced the diktat upon their fallen enemies. Britain was dealt with in another agreement that will be covered in a future video. France was especially humiliated by Article 231 of the treaty, which read, "The Central Powers affirm and France accepts the guilt and blame of France and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Central Powers and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of France and her allies. Austria and her allies acted in a purely defensive means and bear no fault for the conflict." Similar clauses were installed in the treaties with Serbia and Russia, giving the Central Powers the massive propaganda benefit of purported defensive ambitions, and alleviated tensions with their own socialist parties who wished to maintain a allegedly defensive mindset. France was forced to accept their political, economic, and militaristic subjection to Germany, who were officially given preeminence and supremacy via a customs union. Germany, getting a little too big for their britches, initially wanted France to accept German supremacy to all of Europe, but Karl saw this as an affront to his nation's honor, so Habsburg ministers began working to drastically reduce the totality of the treaty. There was also a growing divide within the German camp over the treaty, between the pro-annexation wing, mainly the military and industrialists, and the anti-annexation wing, led by Chancellor Bethmann and a large contingent of the Reichstag. Note that Bethmann was never sacked as a chancellor here, as the war progressed splendidly under his vision. As Arthur J. May wrote in The Passing of the Habsburg Monarchy 1914-1918, Volume 1, quote, "The German Supreme Command considered the Chancellor a weakling." They were backed up by, quote, "Germany's intellectuals as well as businessmen and landowners who overwhelmingly supported large-scale annexations," according to Alexander Watson's Ring of Steel. Watson explained that, quote, "Bethmann was, by contemporary standards, a moderate annexationist." Although the original September program was not actually an official government policy, highlighted by the fact that the Kaiser actually never signed off on it, as the war progressed, the German demands only grew to justify the heavy costs of the war. By 1918, most within the military didn't view this as the war to end all wars. Instead, Ludendorff wanted to use this peace to set up the final showdown where the Reich could finally crush the British. As this was Germany, the military eventually bulldozed the Reichstag into submission. France lost the Brie Basin, so their critical Longwy-Brie mines, which were responsible for 81% of their iron ore and the vast majority of their steel industry, was gone. Alsace-Lothringen was expanded as well, acquiring Belfort and resetting the border along the Vosges Mountains. Luxembourg was integrated into Germany and expanded into Belgium, who was subordinated as a German puppet. French Flanders, with Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne, where most of the population was Flemish, was given to Belgium, just as the September program stated. The fates of Belgium and Luxembourg will be covered in more detail in future videos. Somewhat surprisingly, Austria pushed for sizable annexations for their Italian puppets. Nice and Savoy went over to the ever-growing Duchy of Parma, while Corsica went to Tuscany. Although rather contradictory towards their assumed aims, the devious Habsburgs had something up their sleeves and wanted to appeal to their liberated Italian allies. Germany attempted to give Roussillon and the Basque Country to Spain, but Austria blocked these gestures, desperate to prevent any means of increasing King Alfonso's popularity. The colonial losses for France were not as extreme as one might assume. Contrary to some other people's ideas, according to World War I in Southeast Asia, Colonialism and Anti-Colonialism in the Era of Global Conflict by Heather Street Salter, Germany expressed literally zero interest in establishing any colonial protectorate over French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The extent of their actions were just some minor support to local rebel groups. Here, with relations towards the Triple Monarchy rapidly deteriorating, Germany sought to strengthen ties with Holland, so forced France to cede them Indochina in exchange for a new customs union between Germany and the Netherlands. This also served to weaken the French further, ignoring Austrian pleas for a restrained peace. As the Germans already had their own Chinese port of Qingdao, the French port of Zhangzhuan had little value to them, so it was returned to China. They hoped that this could be the start of a partnership to rival the Anglo-Japanese alliance. As David Stenson discussed in 1914-1918, the history of the First World War, Japan's 1915 21 demands were bent on, quote, reducing China to a virtual protectorate. As Britain essentially enabled the Japanese during the war, it seemed possible. The remaining French Pacific Islands were taken by Germany. In Africa, where it must be noted that Germany had lost control of their own colonies since the war's outbreak, their ambitions were slightly limited. Early ambitions of a ginormous Mittel Africa were long since past. Not only were many of the African colonies money pits, but Britain made it quite clear. We have a navy, you don't, so don't be ridiculous in your demands. France lost Dahomey from French West Africa, while Gabon, French Congo, and Abogni-Chari and parts of Chad all greatly expanded Cameroon. Morocco, a major source of tensions from before the war, with two separate crises, was given formal independence from France, but Germany and Austria received economic zones similar to the Anglo-Russian agreements over Persia. The two also received ports in Agadir and Mogador, respectively, for military and trade purposes. War reparations, harsher than the historical ones on Germany, were placed upon the French, whose banks were forced to forgive German war debts and absorb reparation payments through punitive financial clauses. This was done to cripple any chances France had at quickly rebuilding from the devastation, ensuring Germany time to cement the new order as the continental power. But the Austrians undercut them again, greatly reducing the amount of war reparations from the French. Harsh demilitarizing sanctions were not placed on France, as they would have been unnecessary and caused more issues. Austria was unofficially backing Foch's temporary role, and the general populace was sick of war, so had no aims at immediate retaliation. They were more concerned with Germany and Austria's continued occupation, which would only end after repayments, just as Germany had done back in 1871. The treatment of French citizens in the German and Austrian occupation zones reflected the policies of Berlin and Vienna. The German zone was notorious for a number of killings of civilians who were allegedly Frankturers, guerrillas, responsible for murdering German troops, though there was very little evidence to support this. Thousands of buildings were burnt down as retaliation, while numerous heinous sexual activities were reported.
Are we the baddies?
Austria's zone was a lot more peaceful, as the soldiers were ordered to treat the locals with respect and avoid violence at all costs, building goodwill with them whenever possible. Emperor Karl personally funded the reconstruction of numerous churches that were damaged during the war, growing his popularity with the French right. In short, one empire believed in terror, the other believed in tourism. The new French government, the Fourth Republic, was Republican in name alone. Foch essentially presided over a military junta where the military was outside the standard legal system. Officially, Foch had no role in the government. Unofficially, the government had no role in the governing. Raised in a middle-class Catholic family, with his brother a Jesuit priest, the 1905 separation of church and state was repealed, reinstituting Napoleon's 1801 Concordat, restoring the civil status of the Catholic Church. Many on the right blamed the foolish polity of laicite, secularism, on the loss. They were clearly punished by the Almighty God for trying to shut him out of their state, citing numerous Bible passages like Nahum 1 verses 2 and 3. The Lord is a jealous God and avenging. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and of great might, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. All you needed to do was see what happened to Italy, who destroyed the Papal States, the seat of the Vicar of Christ. Then Italy was utterly destroyed.
Coincidence? I think not.
The divine was more apparent in 2 Chronicles 7:14. If people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Had not Austria been on the slow road to collapse, but they never abandoned the Catholic religion, so were rewarded for their strong devotion, rebounding back as arguably Europe's greatest power. While by no means deeply religious, Foch needed to appease the right to keep the temporarily weakened left at bay, so went along with many of their aims, although careful not to overdo this church power. The ugly realities of the Dreyfus affair came roaring back to France after the war. The affair was a French scandal from the turn of the century when Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish French soldier, was wrongfully convicted of selling military secrets to the Germans. The military uncovered his innocence and discovered the actual perpetrator, but covered up the evidence for years. Anti-Semitism ran rampant across France as a result before Dreyfus was eventually adjudicated. Foch and the military pushed their own stabbed in the back myth to shield themselves from any faults, and the explanation was quickly accepted. It was not the military's fault for the loss. The anti-war liberals, and more importantly, the Jewish Marxists were the reason for the loss. After all, Charles Rappaport was a foreign Jew who only wanted to destroy France after thoroughly corrupting it from within. If they had listened to the right during the Dreyfus affair and banished all foreign enemies,
I'm not gonna say what race, what people.
then they could have won. Newspapers like La Libre Parole merged pro-Catholic clericalism with anti-Semitic rhetoric, emerging a new and strong faction of the right. On the left, Joux and the PUT emerged with syndicalism as a major force. They advocated for worker control over industry through trade unions rather than Marxist aims of direct state control. The PUT was very appealing to trade unions, worker cooperatives, moderate socialists, and, obviously, syndicates. Surviving remnants of the SFIO who escaped the Purge Blanche soon joined the movement. The left bemoaned the regressive policy switchback to the Napoleonic Concordat, fearing that the horrors of the Ancien regime, the pre-revolutionary French system, could once more return. To them, Catholicism represented the horrors of the monarchy and brought back many political, religious, and class divides that would only hamper progress. Thankfully for Foch, Joux strongly opposed violence, so it made it easy to keep the syndicalists in check. Not all of France was that extreme, with more moderate parties emerging on both sides of the political aisle, but the nation was racked by political instability. In general, extremism was rampant. They'd already tried normal political parties and ideologies, so radical solutions were clearly the answer. The National Bloc, a center-right coalition of centrist, conservative liberals, and some Catholic clericalists led by Alexandre Millerand, was elected, allegedly. In reality, they were appointed by the military to try and quell tensions, but the situation was quite dire. It seemed as if the only thing the French could agree on was hatred for Germany and a more subtle disdain for the Italians. While they had always viewed Italy as inferior, many now regretted helping the Savoyards create that cursed country in the first place. Things were better when it was an even field between themselves and Austria, without either being able to cement control. Despite the general unrest and radicalism, the people were pretty anti-war. They had just lost another major conflict with millions of casualties, their husbands, fathers, sons, or brothers. In their current state, they had little to no natural defenses, with Germany extruding deep into their natural borders, while the Alpine passes were held by Parma. With the vast majority of their industrial sector annexed by Germany, massive unemployment issues plagued the nation, while marauding bands of unemployed soldiers formed gangs, exacerbating civil strife. Vive la unemployment. Due to the poor economic conditions, many fled to Quebec or America to find work, and they were eager to forget about the war. This only served to further France's historical population crisis that greatly maimed them during the interwar period. Now that France was fully beneath the German heel, as Austria was powerless to prevent their subjugation, the far more challenging negotiations were about to begin. So make sure to subscribe to see the fate of the British Empire. Future videos will also cover Germany, Russia, America, and the Ottomans, all in the world of Doppeladler. I'm currently working to turn this into a Hearts-Fire 4 mod like Kaiserreich, so if you want to help, join my Discord server. Please consider supporting me on Patreon as it allows me to make more videos like this. Peace out, just like France always does. Anyways, you can watch another great video here. See ya.